The past is another place. They do things differently there. Notice the use of my words. They do things differently. Not they did things differently, but they do things differently. I'm very fortunate that I'm British because the British Isles have such a long history, and I have been exposed to many buildings that have been built during many different centuries. And over the centuries, these buildings were built for different purposes, using many different mediums, like stone, brick, wood, straw, and mud. But also, over the centuries, they used different techniques of construction. So it really is a good idea to know when your place was built, because a lot of what we use in construction or renovation today cannot be used or applied to these older buildings. Here is an example. This is a building in Montauban, and the building has had a cement render applied to it, not a lime mortar. The cement-based product is quick drying, and this was used all over Europe after the Second World War to repair buildings quickly. But they didn't know what damage the cement does to the old brick. That damage became exposed many years later. These older bricks need to breathe, and the lime mortar helps with this process, but the cement doesn't, and it traps the moisture in the brick, and eventually making the bricks brittle, leading to its failure. So I need to know when this chateau was built, so that I can apply the same techniques and materials to the building, so that I know that any of my renovations I do not cause any damage to the chateau. The information I have at the moment means that all I have is options. But by finding out all the information I can about the chateau, and with all this gained knowledge, I will then have choices of how to proceed with any renovations, knowing that anything I do will not have done harm to the chateau for the future. So how can I date the building? Seeing the name of the chateau marked on maps back to the 14th century does not necessarily mean that this is when the chateau was built. All across Europe, many old castles and chateaux were torn down and replaced with the most modern buildings of that date of construction. And it's common to see a 19th century chateau built on a 12th century moat. The agent's details said this chateau is, in their opinion, 18th century. Now, I can understand thinking that, because during the 18th century there was a fashion for building in a style known as Gothic Revival, and inside the chateau there are decorative features that are in the style of the 18th century. But the decorative features of the 18th century also became fashionable again in the mid-1950s. So I asked the question, are these from the fashion of the 1950s, or are they from the 18th century? Is this a chateau built in the style of the Gothic Revival, or is it the earlier original? Then there is this building, the pigeonnier. This one is in the style of the late 15th century, early 16th century. These were important buildings, and not anyone could have one. You had to be of a certain rank in the aristocracy and have permission from the overlord. In France, this rule changed after the French Revolution, and many of these pigeonniers popped up all over the countryside. So I ask another question. Is this pigeonnier older than the chateau, or is the chateau older than the pigeonnier? There is this tower on the chateau. I suspected this was a garderobe. And when the new septic tank was being fitted, we uncovered parts of the clay drainage pipe that is attached to the garderobe, and it exits off the rampart. If you're not familiar with a garderobe, they were the old toilets used in castles and chateaux. There were communal ones and private ones for the seigneur, and this one seems to be a private garderobe for the seigneur. At this time, my research has shown me that garderobes went out of fashion around 1511. So I asked the question, is this an original garderobe, or is it part of an 18th century folly? But these are all fixed items. So what about this? I've seen this kind of carved stonework before. A rectangular stone with two carved basins and each of those having a drain. This to me looks like a piscina, as used from the 11th to the 14th century. Archaeologists know how they were used in the sacrament, but they are still unsure how. They presume that one basin was used for washing the hands before Mass, and the second was for washing the articles after Mass. But this water has been blessed, and therefore it's sacred. So this water cannot just be discarded, hence the drain, which would allow the water to enter into the walls of the building, essentially making the building even more sacred. I have a lot more pieces of carved stone like this around the chateau, but these items are movable, so I don't know if they could have been created for the chateau, or they could have been bought here later on as garden ornaments. So I asked the question, are they original, or are they later arrivals? There is one room inside the chateau that I recognized immediately. It was originally one larger room, but it was divided in the 1960s to make a bedroom and bathroom. Can you guess what this room's original function was? I'll give you a brief description. This room is located on the ground floor on the northwest side of the building. Under the current floor, I found unglazed floor tiles. It has two sets of curved brick arches, and behind the brick arches is a thin layer of fibres and straw, and then it's heavily packed with soil, which has been levelled, and there is a room above. Before the room was divided, this large room had two windows, and it lays directly east-west. Can you guess what this room's original function was? To see these arches, which are normally associated with religious buildings, you would presume that this room was a chapel, but it's not. There are a few clues that tell you what this room was. The first clue to its original purpose is that it's located on the northwest side of the chateau. This area of the building, or any building, gets very little sun and always remains the coldest part of the building. The next clue is the floor tiles. These tiles are unsealed clay floor tiles. Now, in religious buildings or areas set aside for secular activities, these floors are usually made from high-quality marble or highly decorated tiles that have been glazed. The ones used for this floor are unsealed, which means they are porous, and these are used for cooling. The area above the arches has been packed with fibres and soil, and this is done to insulate the room. Building a room in this way, placing it on the northwest side of the building, using thick walls, insulating the arches, and using the unsealed clay floor tiles, and having the small windows for ventilation, they found they could maintain a constant temperature that is ideal for making and storing produce. Hence, the bars on the small windows. This is for security, to protect the valued goods that were contained in the room. This is a buttery. Originally, the buttery had nothing to do with butter. The name comes from the Latin butis, meaning cask, and this is where the barrels, or butts, were stored, and the management of the buttery was overseen by a butler. Knowing that this is a buttery, it tells us more of what was going on here, but it also helps to date the building. While making a floor plan of the chateau, and then making a second copy with the changes that I want to make, I started to study the floor plans of buildings of the 13th century when a buttery was more commonplace. And this is when I discovered that this chateau has the same floor plan as those buildings found in Essex and Kent, in England. You can see they have a buttery, kitchen, pantry, solar, and hall. These are all the primary rooms of a building of the 13th century. Now compare this to Chateau Fenelon here. When you remove the changes and divisions put in the 20th century, you find the floor plan is extremely similar to the 13th century. There is the screen passage, a private parlour with solar above for the seigneur, and another parlour. Now the word parlour comes from the Old French word parloir, meaning to speak, and this room comes from monastic use, where a room was set aside to allow monks of silent orders to converse. There is the open hall for feasting and meeting with a central fire. Next to this is the buttery. Then there is the main kitchen for the building. One room that is missing from Fenelon is the pantry, which would have been located on the south side of the building. The word pantry comes from the Old French word panterie, meaning bread, and this would be a room to store dry goods. So where has it gone? It's another piece to add to the puzzle. I mentioned in the previous videos that documents say that Fenelon was destroyed and rebuilt in 1244. This period in time is quite significant, as it is the beginning of the Renaissance. Now, we mostly associate the Renaissance as being in the 15th and 16th century, with the likes of the Medici, Michelangelo, and Da Vinci, but that period is known as the High Renaissance. We forget the beginning, the period known as the Proto-Renaissance, which began in the middle of the 13th century. This is a period in history when people began to put down their swords and picked up their pens and started to battle with their account books and created commerce. But the middle of the 13th century is also important as it marks the end of what is known as the medieval warm period. This was a time when temperatures were much higher than they are today, and these people would have built their buildings to match the climate. In 2020, I followed all the routines of a building built in the 18th century, as described by the listing details from the estate agent. It was extremely uncomfortable. In 2021, I tried doing the routines of a 17th century chateau, which the previous family presumed was the date of construction. And again, it didn't work. So, for the summer of 2022, with the knowledge of how a buttery works, as an experiment, I tried running the chateau as they would have done in the 13th century, and the results were surprising. And it all comes down to these unsealed clay floor tiles, which are throughout the ground floor of the chateau. You have to remember, the calendar of the 13th century revolved around the saints' days, and not days and months that we are familiar with today. The process all begins on the days of the ice saints. I start by removing all the floor coverings and then check all the legs of the furniture to make sure they are raised off the ground. At sunrise the next morning, I open the upper shutters and the windows of the hallway on the south side of the chateau. Then I open all the windows and shutters on the north side of the chateau. The wind on the north side of the chateau carries cool, moist air from the river Tarn, and this wind is forced up the rampart and into the chateau. Having all the windows open on the north side and a single window open on the south side results in a cross-ventilation through the chateau, and the warm air inside is quickly removed. I then continue to open all the windows and shutters around the chateau. Once this is completed, I then walk down to the natural spring with a bucket to collect water. I bring the bucket of water into the chateau and throw it across the unsealed tiled floor, and move it around evenly. I repeat this process on all the ground floor rooms with unsealed tiles. Within about 10 minutes, all the water is absorbed into the tiles. Around 8 AM, I then close all the shutters on the east, south and west of the chateau, and I also close all of the windows except for one. The window I leave open is the upper window in the south side of the main hallway, but the shutters remain closed. Slowly, during the day, the water that was absorbed into the unsealed tiles begins to evaporate and release moisture into the air to continually cool the chateau down. And the open window in the hall helps draw that rising warm air out. As the sun moves around the chateau, I slowly begin to open the shutters that are located in the areas that are now in the shade, but I keep the windows closed. Doing this, I can keep the indoor temperature between 18 to 22 degrees Celsius, or 64 to 72 degrees Fahrenheit. On extremely hot days, when the temperature exceeds 40 degrees Celsius, or 105 degrees Fahrenheit, I repeat the soaking of the unsealed floor tiles at about 6 PM. This reduces the temperature again to make for a more comfortable night's sleep. At about 10 PM, I can, if I choose, open the windows to let the cooler night air into the chateau, but I leave the shutters closed to stop any insects from venturing in. I repeat this morning routine until Lammas Day, when I start to reduce the amount of water I put onto the floor and focus the attention on the south and the southeast floor areas of the chateau. And I finally stop with the water in the last week of August, the day of the martyrdom of St. John the Baptist. This allows enough time for the floor to completely dry out during September and October before winter begins. Yes, this is a lot of work for a few months of the year, but by doing this work, it costs me nothing in electricity to cool over 9,000 square feet, lowering my carbon footprint and making this old chateau more energy efficient than most buildings built today in the 21st century. But is there a chapel? Because normally a chateau has a chapel, so was there ever a chapel inside this chateau? I don't believe there was, and I believe there is evidence to prove this, and I found it on the Cassini map. The map we know as the Cassini map is a map of France that was published in 1789. But it was started in 1672 by Giovanni Domenico Cassini, by the command of Louis XIV, and the work was continued by many generations of the Cassini family. What we have to remember is that during the 17th and 18th century, not many people could read or write, but they could read and understand symbols, and relate those symbols to what they could see in the landscape. So, if there was something that could be seen in the landscape, it was recorded. This is where I get into a little bit of a problem. It seems that the published legend and key for the map does not match the symbols for this area of the map, which leads me to believe that this area of France was one of the first areas to be recorded by Cassini in the 17th century, but the task was taken over by future generations and the key was slightly changed. So, reading the map, and with my knowledge of the area, I can find the location of the town, and I can find the location of the chateau. I can see that both are next to the river. I can see the main road, the Route de la Vour, is to the south of the chateau, and I can see that At the time this map was made, this road was tree-lined. I can also see that the town and the chateau are within the Diocese of Toulouse and overseen by the Priory of Grand Knights. I can also see that there were many fiefs giving feudal service to the seigneur. And I can see that there is a chateau in Rennes and also Chateau Fenelon. I can also see the locations of the main churches in the villages. And I can also see the locations of the smaller chapels that are dotted around the area. But if you look closely, you notice at Chateau Fenelon, we have the symbol for the chapel that is unshaded and reversed, meaning that this is a private chapel. And it's located to the west of the chateau. And this means you would have been able to see these two buildings in the landscape. So the chapel would not be located inside the chateau. But where has it gone? And why was it removed? And is this all that remains of the old chapel? There is another study map from which I can gather more information. If I look at what is known as the Cadastre Napoleon from around 1805, the chapel is not there, but the size of the chateau is much bigger. And it looks like I have found the location of the 13th century pantry. It was here, but it has been removed. And if you study the building, you will notice the evidence of its previous existence on the chateau. The Cadastre Napoleon is a property plan that was introduced by Napoleon and completed by 1812. It is a map that was created as a legal and fiscal tool and is still in use today. People were taxed on the land they held and the rooms they used. So, to reduce the amount of tax to pay, many property owners removed or tore down parts of the buildings that were superfluous to requirement, or they had rooms blocked up so they could no longer be accessed, thus reducing their tax. And it seems this is what has happened here, because you see the size of the chateau on the cadastre, but then look at this old photo, and you see many areas have been removed.
I'm no buildings expert, but everything that I have discovered through my research, like from this book from the 1920s, which talks about the Middle Ages and feudal chateaus, is all pointing towards this being a chateau from the 13th century. But the problem I've got is this is made of brick, and we more commonly associate brick being used in the 16th century, or the Tudor period as we call it. But through my research, I also found a little note made by the Count of Toulouse in 1280, where he was putting in a new law about the size of the bricks being used and the quality of the bricks that were to come out of Toulouse. Now, this being in 1280 means that there must have been a problem that he was trying to rectify. So this problem must have been going on for a long time, which would match the whole idea of this chateau being built in 1244. And the earliest example I found of a chateau built of brick, which is a fortified chateau, is in Belgium, and this was built in 1300. The word chateau in French is a very broad term. In English, it's more specific to a style. And what I'm having a problem is following the evolution of the chateau from castle to palaces. Now, I do understand that many chateaux were torn down and replaced in the 18th and 19th century. But that makes me ask the question, is this one of the earliest examples of a chateau? And if it is, that's a lot of pressure and responsibility on me on how I decide to go forwards with the renovations. Now, the purist in me would say return it back to the 13th century. But that would be a lie, because it would be removing all of the history following that period. And that's all part of the story of the chateau. But I can use this to my advantage, because I can take those elements from these different periods in time and use them. Those helpful elements, like the unsealed tile floors, which I'll definitely be keeping. There are a few more elements that can help me in discovering the age of this chateau. Like out here, for example, in the barn. If I look on this beam, it looks like it's a replacement. But on this beam, it looks like an original that hasn't been removed. So I need to find somebody who can do some dendrochronology and date these things. Now, I do realize taking a core sample and dating this piece of wood won't tell me when this building was built, but it will help me understand when the tree was felled. And the older one looks like it's been left in situ. But there is one other thing that's been puzzling me. When I've been looking at all these other chateaus before buying this one, every chateau had a cellar. But this one doesn't. But I suspect there is. Compare these two photos of the chateau. This is on the south side. This is as it is today. And this is back at the end of the 19th century. Now look closer again, just down in this corner. This looks like an opening. I think I have a cellar. Finding out if I have a cellar will help me date the building. But I think that's going to take some time, because there's only me doing this on my own at the moment. Not that I want to do it on my own, but that is my current situation. But I do plan to make more videos, because what I've shown you in these first 3 videos is only just the tip of the iceberg of what's going on here. And my research has turned up so many more things about this place, but there's too much to put into these first 3, but it can take me on to a lot more. So like, share and subscribe and get this out there, so I can get the experts that I need in order to help me understand what's going on here. So thank you for watching, and please leave a comment, because any of your comments can help direct me into understanding what is going on with this puzzle of a chateau.
If you have an interest in crafts, then why not take a moment to check out my website, where you can discover a whole range of needlepoint kits and cross-stitch patterns that have been inspired by my time living at Chateau Fenelon. The designs range from the traditional to the contemporary, in a variety of colors to suit your decor, and are designed for beginners and intermediates. The needlepoint kits comprise of a design that is printed on high-quality cotton mono canvas that has been cut big enough to fit comfortably into your own scroll frame, and the design is worked using 4-ply wool, which is also supplied in the kit, with 2 tapestry needles. Cross-stitch patterns are also available as PDF downloads. Keep checking the website from time to time, because as I get new samples completed, these designs will be available for purchase, and these purchases will help with the chateau restoration. Thank you.